It was January 2nd, 1967. The morning had dawned cold and overcast across the Red River Delta, with thick clouds blanketing North Vietnam from the Chinese border to the coast. Inside the command bunker at Phuc Yen Air Base, 30 kilometers northwest of Hanoi, the radio chatter crackled with the routine confidence of men who had watched this same scenario play out dozens of times before. A senior ground controller, a veteran of 3 years of air defense operations, leaned forward over his radar scope, watching the glowing green blips crawl across the screen from the west. The returns were clear and unmistakable. His voice was calm, almost bored, as he reported to his superiors. American strike package, inbound from Laos, multiple contacts, altitude 14,000 feet, speed 450 knots, electronic countermeasures active. The signature was perfect. These were Republic F-105 Thunderchiefs, the feared bomb trucks that had been pounding North Vietnamese targets relentlessly since Operation Rolling Thunder had begun in March of 1965. The controller knew these aircraft intimately. He had tracked them on his scopes hundreds of times. The F-105 was a massive single-seat fighter bomber, weighing over 50,000 pounds fully loaded, designed to carry up to 14,000 pounds of bombs deep into enemy territory at supersonic speed. But fully loaded with bombs and external fuel tanks, the Thunderchief was anything but agile. It was a pig, the American pilots called it. It could run in a straight line at Mach 1.2, but it could not turn, could not climb quickly, and could not fight. It was a bomb delivery vehicle, not a fighter, and that made it perfect prey for the MiG-21s of the 921st Fighter Regiment. The formations on his scope were flying at exactly 14,000 feet, precisely the altitude the Americans always used when approaching targets in the Hanoi area. They were using the same ingress routes they had flown 100 times before, following the valleys west of the capital to avoid the concentrated surface-to-air missile belts that ring the city. The electronic signatures matched perfectly. The QRC-160 jamming pods, designed to blind North Vietnamese radar, were painting their characteristic pattern on the scopes, creating the familiar strobing interference that the controllers had learned to recognize and compensate for. Every detail was exactly as it should be. This was routine. This was a textbook American bombing mission. This was easy prey for pilots who had been trained to exploit exactly this scenario. The controller reached for his radio handset. He knew exactly what would happen next. He had executed this intercept profile so many times that it had become almost mechanical. He would vector the MiG-21s up to the clouds, guiding them with precise heading and altitude commands. The controller reached for his radio handset. He knew exactly what would happen next. He had executed this intercept profile so many times that it had become almost mechanical. He would vector the MiG-21s up through the clouds, guiding them with precise heading and altitude commands. Position them behind and slightly below the lumbering American bombers. Let the pilots acquire the targets visually as they broke through the cloud layer, and give them clearance to fire their heat-seeking atoll missiles into the vulnerable exhaust pipes of the Thunderchiefs. Then, before the American escort fighters could react, before the F-4 Phantoms that typically flew high cover could dive down to engage, the MiGs would execute a steep dive back through the clouds to safety, disappearing into the ground clutter on American radar, racing back to their bases or, if necessary, across the border into Chinese airspace, where the Americans were forbidden to pursue. It was a tactic that had worked brilliantly throughout the final months of 1966, earning the Vietnamese People's Air Force a reputation far beyond what their numbers suggested. The MiG-21 pilots of the 921st Fighter Regiment had become masters of the hit-and-run engagement, perfecting what Western intelligence officers called guerrilla tactics in the air. They struck like vipers and vanished like smoke. Their success was measured not just in aircraft destroyed, but in missions aborted, bombs jettisoned early, American formations disrupted and scattered. In December of 1966 alone, they had destroyed 14 F-105 Thunderchiefs without losing a single MiG-21 in air-to-air combat. It was an extraordinary kill ratio, one that had Soviet advisors taking notes and American commanders losing sleep. The tactic had become so successful that North Vietnamese fighter pilots had grown confident to the point of near arrogance. They believed they understood American tactics completely. They believed they held the advantage. They believed the Americans would never fundamentally change their approach. The order was given with crisp military efficiency. Scramble! Among the MiG-21s responding to the alert, 4 interceptors in the lead flight roared down the runway at Phuc Yen, their powerful Tumansky turbojet engines screaming at full military power as they clawed for altitude, trailing black smoke from their afterburners. The runway, built by Soviet engineers and protected by multiple rings of anti-aircraft artillery and surface-to-air missile sites, had become the epicenter of North Vietnam's air defense network. The pilots were confident, almost eager, their hands steady on the control sticks as they retracted their landing gear and began their climb toward the intercept point. Among them was a young wingman named Nguyen Van Coc, 24 years old, born in Viet Yen district near Hanoi, flying in formation with some of the most experienced fighter pilots in the Vietnamese People's Air Force. Nguyen Van Coc's path to the cockpit of a MiG-21 had been forged in tragedy and determination. His father and uncle, both members of the Viet Minh resistance movement, had been killed by French colonial forces when he was only 5 years old. Growing up near Chu Air Base, he had developed an obsessive fascination with aircraft, watching the fighters take off and land, dreaming of the day he would fly one himself. He had enlisted in the Vietnamese People's Air Force in 1961 and spent 4 grueling years undergoing pilot training in the Soviet Union at Bataisk and Krasnodar air bases, learning to fly in the harsh winters of southern Russia, mastering the difficult handling characteristics of the MiG-15 and MiG-17 before transitioning to the high-performance MiG-21. The MiG-21 was unlike anything most Vietnamese pilots had flown before. It was temperamental, demanding, and unforgiving of mistakes. Its tailed delta wing configuration gave it excellent high-speed performance, but made it tricky to land, with a tendency to float during the flare if the pilot mismanaged his approach speed. The aircraft had killed several Vietnamese trainees during the conversion process, but in the hands of a skilled pilot, it was a lethal weapon. Siose had proven himself skilled. He had completed his training and returned to North Vietnam in time to join the 921st Fighter Regiment as it transitioned from the older subsonic MiG-17 to the supersonic MiG-21 in the spring of 1966. Now, less than 9 months later, he was climbing through the overcast on what should have been a routine intercept mission. The 4 MiGs climbed through the thick layer of clouds blanketing the Red River Delta, the pilots flying tight formation on instruments, trusting their heading indicators and altimeters as the gray mist streamed past their canopies. They broke into brilliant sunlight at 15,000 feet, the sudden transition from gray gloom to blue sky momentarily dazzling. Above them stretched the perfect blue of a winter sky. Below them, the cloud deck extended to the horizon like a white ocean. And somewhere beneath those clouds, the ground controller's voice informed them, were the American bombers, fat and slow and vulnerable. Their ground controller's voice continued to guide them with calm precision. Target bearing 270 degrees, range 20 kilometers, altitude 14,000 feet, multiple contacts, heavy formation. This is a standard bombing run. Strike aircraft confirmed. You are cleared to engage on visual identification. Strike now. Execute attack pattern Delta. Fire and disengage on my command. The MiG pilots armed their weapons with practiced efficiency, flipping the master arm switch, listening for the steady tone that indicated their K-13 Atoll missiles were powered up and ready to fire. They checked their fuel gauges. They had perhaps 30 minutes of combat time before they would need to return to base. They verified their formation spacing. They prepared for the killing pass they had practiced dozens of times in training and executed successfully in combat against the American Thunderchiefs. The lead pilot rolled his Delta Wing fighter toward the American formation below, beginning his descent through a gap in the clouds, positioning himself for the classic 6 o'clock attack from behind and slightly below the target. His wingmen followed, spacing themselves for mutual support, ready to engage multiple targets simultaneously. This was textbook. This was routine. This should have been easy. But as they rolled their aircraft toward the American formation and began to acquire visual contact through breaks in the cloud layer, something began to feel terribly, catastrophically wrong. The silhouettes emerging from the clouds below were not the familiar shark-nosed F-105 Thunderchiefs with their distinctive forward fuselages and single vertical stabilizers. Instead, the MiG pilots found themselves looking at twin-tailed, twin-engined beasts with anhedral stabilators and cranked wings carrying what appeared to be a full combat load of air-to-air missiles. These were McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom IIs, not the bomb-laden strike aircraft they had expected, not the vulnerable targets they had been promised. These were dedicated air superiority fighters, the most advanced interceptor in the American inventory, and they were configured for combat with a full loadout of missiles and nothing else. No bombs weighing them down. No external fuel tanks limiting their maneuverability. Just weapons and fuel, and 2 highly trained crew members whose sole mission was to kill enemy fighters. And the Americans were not running. The Phantoms were not maintaining their steady course toward a target. They were not climbing away to safety. They were turning hard into the engagement, afterburners lighting, accelerating, maneuvering aggressively into attack positions. The F-4s broke formation with precision and violence, splitting into fighting pairs, each element covering the other, vectoring directly toward the MiGs with obvious lethal intent. The lead Phantom pilot had clearly seen the MiGs emerging from the clouds and had reacted instantly, abandoning any pretense of being a bomber formation and transitioning immediately to offensive air combat maneuvering. This was not a bomber escort responding defensively to an unexpected threat. This was an ambush. This was a trap, and the MiG pilots had flown directly into it with absolute confidence that they were attacking vulnerable strike aircraft. The MiG pilots had been lured into a perfectly executed aerial ambush. This moment of supreme and fatal confidence would become one of the most devastating tactical reversals in the history of air combat. The North Vietnamese had been deceived by a ruse so simple, so audacious, that it would fundamentally change the air war over Vietnam. This was Operation Bolo. And the laughter that had once echoed through Hanoi's command centers would die in the clouds that afternoon, replaced by the screaming roar of American missiles and the desperate radio calls of pilots ejecting from burning aircraft. If you want to understand the real high-stakes stories of aerial warfare and the tactics that defined the Vietnam War, subscribe to our channel, Cold War Impact. The roots of Operation Bolo stretch back through the bloody autumn of 1966, when American losses over North Vietnam had reached a crisis point that threatened the entire bombing campaign. The United States Air Force was conducting Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained and increasingly intense bombing campaign designed to pressure Hanoi into abandoning its support for the communist insurgency in South Vietnam. It had begun modestly in March of 1965 with limited strikes against military targets, but had gradually escalated into a massive aerial onslaught involving thousands of sorties per month. Wave after wave of F-105 Thunderchief fighter bombers flew north from bases in Thailand and South Vietnam, carrying their loads of conventional 500 and 750-pound bombs toward heavily defended targets around Hanoi and Haiphong. The campaign was governed by complex and often contradictory rules of engagement dictated by political concerns in Washington. President Lyndon Johnson and his civilian advisors, terrified of accidentally triggering a wider war with China or the Soviet Union, had imposed strict limitations on what could be targeted and how. North Vietnamese airfields were off-limits until April of 1967. The port of Haiphong, where Soviet ships unloaded weapons and supplies, could not be mined or bombed. Targets within 10 miles of the Chinese border were forbidden. Surface-to-air missile sites could only be attacked if they were actively firing. The result was a campaign that maximized American casualties while minimizing pressure on the North Vietnamese leadership. But the North Vietnamese defense was not just a matter of political restrictions. It was a sophisticated, layered system that Soviet advisors had helped design and that North Vietnamese forces executed with increasing skill. The defense was built on a triad, three interlocking systems that supported and protected each other. First were the SA-75 Divina surface-to-air missiles, known to NATO as SA-2 guidelines, supplied by the Soviet Union and operated by North Vietnamese crews trained in Russia. These radar-guided weapons forced American aircraft to fly low to evade them, typically below 10,000 feet where the missiles were less effective. But flying low brought the Americans into the engagement envelope of the second layer, the massed anti-aircraft artillery. North Vietnam had deployed thousands of anti-aircraft guns, ranging from 23mm rapid-fire cannon to 85mm and 100mm heavy guns, all radar-directed, all firing in coordinated barrages that created walls of exploding steel through which American pilots had to fly. And then there were the MiGs, the third element of the triad. The fighters were not expected to win a war of attrition. They were scalpels, not hammers, employed to inflict maximum disruption with minimum exposure. They waited until the Americans were already stressed by missiles and anti-aircraft fire, already low on fuel, already thinking about egressing the target area, and then they struck. The MiG-21, NATO codename Fishbed, had arrived in North Vietnam in April of 1966 and represented a quantum leap in capability over the older MiG-17. It was a revelation, a glimpse of Soviet design philosophy at its most elegant and lethal. Soviet-built, delta-winged, capable of Mach 2, it was a pure interceptor designed for one mission and one mission only: to climb fast, kill fast, and escape fast. The aircraft was small, presenting a tiny radar cross-section. Its maximum speed was 1,352 miles per hour. Its climb rate was exceptional, exceeding 36,000 feet per minute in some variants. It was armed with a single 23mm cannon in an external pod, and most critically, up to 4 Vimpel K-13 Atoll infrared-guided missiles. These missiles, copied from early American AIM-9 Sidewinders, captured during the Taiwan Strait crisis, had an effective range of roughly 4 miles and were devastatingly accurate when fired from close range against an unsuspecting target, generating high heat. The North Vietnamese fighter pilots, trained extensively in the Soviet Union at Batatsk and Krasnodar air bases, flew under the tight control of ground-based radar operators. This ground-controlled intercept doctrine meant the pilots were not hunting freely. They were pieces on a chessboard, moved into position by controllers who could see the entire battlefield on their radar scopes. The Americans called it ambush tactics, and it was brutally effective. The MiGs would orbit at low altitude, hidden in ground clutter, invisible to American airborne radar. When an F-105 strike package approached, the controllers would vector the MiGs up through the clouds to a perfect firing position, typically behind and slightly below the American formation. The MiG pilot would acquire the target visually, wait for the distinctive growl of his missile's infrared seeker locking onto the hot exhaust of a Thunderchief, and fire. One pass, then a steep dive back through the clouds to safety. By late 1966, this tactic had tilted the air war decisively in Hanoi's favor. The Americans were hemorrhaging aircraft and experienced crews. The rules of engagement imposed by political leadership in Washington, terrified of accidentally triggering a wider war with China or the Soviet Union, made the problem worse. American fighter pilots were forbidden to attack North Vietnamese airfields. The MiGs could take off, kill, land, refuel, and take off again with complete impunity. They were untouchable on the ground. American pilots were also forbidden to fire their missiles beyond visual range without positive visual identification. This negated the F-4 Phantom's greatest advantage, its powerful ANAPQ-100 radar and long-range Sparrow missiles. The frustration in the American fighter community was volcanic. Colonel Robin Olds, the newly appointed commander of the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing, based at Ubon Royal Thai Air Force Base in Thailand, arrived in Southeast Asia in September of 1966 with a reputation and a mandate. He was 44 years old, a World War II fighter ace with 12 confirmed kills against the German Luftwaffe flying P-38 Lightnings and P-51 Mustangs over occupied Europe. He was an old-school fighter pilot, aggressive, profane, mustachioed, a hard-drinking brawler who led from the front cockpit. He had been sent to revive the performance of the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing, which had been mauled by the MiGs in the weeks before his arrival. Within 5 days of taking command, his wing lost an F-4C to an air-to-air missile fired by a MiG-21, the first such loss in the war. This followed 2 other F-4 losses in the 2 weeks before Olds took command. Olds studied the problem with the cold, analytical eye of a combat veteran who had spent 20 years thinking about how to kill enemy fighters. He had flown against the Luftwaffe over occupied Europe, battling Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s in the skies over Germany, and he brought that hard-earned experience to bear on the problem of the MiG-21. He recognized immediately that the North Vietnamese were not winning because their pilots were individually better than American pilots. They were not. American pilots had better training, more flight hours, superior situational awareness, and more combat experience on average. But the North Vietnamese were winning because their system was better. They had built a tactical framework that maximized their advantages while minimizing their weaknesses. And they executed that framework with disciplined precision. The Americans, Olds realized, had fallen into a deadly rut of predictability. The strike packages flew the same routes because those routes had been approved by the targeting committees in Saigon and Washington. They used the same altitudes because those altitudes had been determined to be optimal for bombing accuracy while avoiding the worst of the surface-to-air missile threat. They refueled at the same tanker tracks because those tracks were positioned to provide maximum loiter time over the target area. They used the same radio call signs because those call signs had been assigned by the operations planners, and changing them required coordination across multiple wings and squadrons. The entire system was optimized for efficiency and coordination, but it had become completely transparent to the enemy. The North Vietnamese ground controllers had months of intelligence data. They knew everything. Most damning of all, Olds discovered that the QRC-160 electronic countermeasures pods carried by the F-105s created such a distinctive radar signature that North Vietnamese operators could identify an F-105 formation from an F-4 formation at ranges exceeding 50 miles. The F-4s, which had initially been left without the jamming pods due to a shortage, painted a different electronic picture on enemy scopes. The jamming patterns were different, the radar cross-sections were different, everything was different, and the North Vietnamese ground controllers, who had been studying American formations for over a year, had become expert at reading these signatures. They knew which formations were vulnerable strike aircraft and which were dangerous fighter escorts. And they only committed their MiGs when they had the advantage, when they were certain they were attacking bombers rather than fighters. Olds realized that the Americans could not attack the airfields, so they had to lure the MiGs into the air on American terms. He needed to dangle bait that Hanoi could not resist. He needed the MiGs to scramble expecting easy kills, only to find themselves in a knife fight with the deadliest air superiority fighter in the American inventory, flown by crews who had trained for exactly this moment. The plan he developed with his tactics officer, Captain John B. Stone, and his deputy commander for operations, Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Chappie James Jr., was elegant in its simplicity. The F-4 Phantoms would masquerade as F-105 Thunderchiefs. They would fly the exact same routes, at the exact same altitudes, at the exact same speeds. They would use the same radio call signs. They would carry the same QRC-160 electronic countermeasures pods that the Thunderchiefs used to jam North Vietnamese radar. On the enemy's scopes, in their radio intercepts, in every measurable way, the American formation would look exactly like a standard bombing mission. But when the MiGs came up to intercept the lumbering bomb-laden targets, they would instead encounter F-4 Phantoms, stripped of bombs, loaded with missiles, and flown by the best fighter pilots in the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing. Olds presented the plan to General William Momeyer, commanding the 7th Air Force, on December 22, 1966. Momeyer approved it immediately and assigned it the code name Bolo, after the Filipino cane-cutting machete that doubled as a martial arts weapon. Sharp and deadly, the Bolo does not appear to be a weapon until the opponent is drawn in too close to evade. That was the intent. Draw the MiGs into the Phantom's killing zone and strike while the North Vietnamese were still expecting to find the less dangerous F-105s. The operation required meticulous preparation. Olds ordered his maintenance crews to inspect, clean, and repair every piece of equipment on the aircraft assigned to the mission. The work took days. Every Phantom was fitted with the external fuel tanks and electronic countermeasures pods that would make them electronically indistinguishable from Thunderchiefs. The pilots rehearsed the timing, the speeds, the formations. They studied the weapons envelopes of their missiles. They memorized MiG maneuverability charts. They practiced fuel management. They drilled tank jettison procedures. They reviewed the rules of engagement until every man knew exactly when he was cleared to fire. Olds assigned his best crews to lead the strike. He would fly the lead element himself, call sign Olds Flight. Lieutenant Colonel Chappie James, one of the first African-American fighter pilots to command a combat squadron, would lead the second element, call sign Ford Flight. Captain John Stone would lead the third element, call sign Rambler Flight. Additional flights from the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing and the 366th Tactical Fighter Wing would follow at 5-minute intervals. creating the appearance of a massive, sustained bombing raid. The original date was set for January 1st, 1967. Bad weather forced a 24-hour delay. On the afternoon of January 2nd, under clearing but still overcast skies, the operation launched. 28 F-4C Phantoms took off from Ubon and climbed toward their refueling tracks over Laos. Behind them, F-105s from the 355th and 388th Tactical Fighter Wings launched on genuine Iron Hand missions, ready to suppress North Vietnamese surface-to-air missile sites if the Phantoms ran into trouble. Every detail was perfect. The formations flew at exactly the altitude and speed the F-105s always used. The pilots spoke on the radios using F-105 call signs. The jamming pods radiated their distinctive electronic signature. To the North Vietnamese radar operators tracking the formations as they crossed from Laos into North Vietnam, this was just another American bombing mission. A lucrative target, an opportunity. At Phuoc Yên Air Base, the order was given: scramble the MiG-21s. The ground controllers were confident. They had no reason to suspect deception. The electronic intelligence was clear. The formations matched known F-105 profiles exactly. The 921st Fighter Regiment launched between 11 and 14 MiG-21s, depending on which historical account is consulted. Among the pilots climbing into the cold January sky were some of the best in the Vietnamese People's Air Force, men who would later become aces. And flying as wingman in one of the flights was Nguyen Van Coc, a 24-year-old pilot who would, before the war ended, become North Vietnam's highest-scoring ace with 9 credited kills. But on this day, he would learn the hardest lesson of his combat career. Old's flight, the lead element, arrived over the target area near Phuoc Yên at 1500 hours local time. The ground below was obscured by a thick deck of clouds. Olds orbited, waiting, watching. The North Vietnamese ground controllers saw the orbiting aircraft and made their decision. The MiGs came up. Olds saw them first. Delta-winged shadows popping through the cloud layer one by one, climbing hard, trying to position themselves for the classic tail attack they had practiced so many times. The MiGs were in a loose trail formation, spaced about 1,000 feet apart. Each pilot focused on finding the American bombers he expected to see. They were climbing through 13,000 feet, building airspeed, their pilots scanning visually for targets. Olds keyed his radio, his voice crackling across the tactical frequency with the urgency of a man who had waited months for this moment. MiGs! MiGs at 11 o'clock, low. Multiple bandits climbing through the undercast. Olds flight is engaging. Ford flight, cover our 6. Rambler flight, come left to cut off the escape route. Execute, execute, execute. Then he rolled his Phantom into a hard, descending turn, pulling 6 Gs, feeling the G-suit inflate around his legs and abdomen as the blood tried to drain from his head, vectoring directly toward the first MiG he had spotted. His weapons systems officer in the rear seat, First Lieutenant Charles Clifton, was already working the radar, trying to acquire a lock for a Sparrow shot, calling out ranges and aspect angles. The Phantom responded with the brutal power of its 2 General Electric J79 turbojet engines, each producing 17,000 pounds of thrust in full afterburner. The aircraft accelerated like a rocket, the airspeed indicator winding past 450 knots, the altimeter unwinding as Olds dove toward his target with every ounce of energy his fighter could generate. He was executing the classic fighter pilot's advantage, converting altitude to speed, diving on an enemy who was climbing and therefore slow and vulnerable. The North Vietnamese pilots realized immediately that something was catastrophically wrong, that the carefully rehearsed intercept had become a nightmare. These were not Thunderchiefs. These aircraft were not maintaining a steady bombing run. The formations were breaking apart with violent aggression, not fleeing but attacking with obvious predatory intent. The Americans were not climbing away to evade, but turning into the fight with a ferocity that suggested they had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. And the missiles, the deadly white smoke trails of American air-to-air missiles, were already in the air, streaking toward MiGs that were still trying to understand what had happened to their textbook intercept. The Vietnamese ground controller's voice on the radio had changed from calm confidence to urgent alarm. Evade, evade, those are phantom fighters. This is an ambush. Break off the attack, return to base immediately. But by then it was too late. The trap had been sprung. The MiGs were already engaged in a turning fight with aircraft that had every advantage: position, energy, numbers, and pilots who had trained for months for this exact scenario. Olds closed on his target, a MiG-21 climbing desperately at full military power, the pilot clearly trying to gain energy for a zoom climb escape, following his training to use the MiG's superior acceleration to disengage from a dangerous situation. But Olds had the angle. He had the speed. He had the weapons. The American pilot aligned his pipper, the aiming reticle in his head-up display, watched the target tracking diamond lock onto the MiG, and waited for the distinctive growl in his headset that indicated his AIM-9 Sidewinder had acquired the target's heat signature and was ready to fire. The growl came. Olds pressed the trigger. An AIM-9 Sidewinder missile left the rail with a roar and a trail of brilliant white smoke, its expanding rod warhead armed and tracking. The missile tracked true, its infrared seeker locked onto the blazing heat of the MiG's turbojet exhaust. 4 seconds later, the warhead detonated just behind the MiG's cockpit, the expanding rods shredding the thin aluminum skin of the fuselage, rupturing the fuel tanks, severing hydraulic lines and control cables. The MiG rolled violently onto its back, trailing black smoke and orange flames, its control surfaces frozen or flapping uselessly. The Vietnamese pilot had no choice. He pulled the ejection handle. The canopy blew off, the rocket seat fired, and the pilot was hurled clear of the dying aircraft. His parachute opened. He would survive to fly another day. But his aircraft, one of North Vietnam's precious few MiG-21s, was gone. Olds' first kill of the engagement, 1 down, multiple more to go. Behind Olds, his wingmen were already engaging. Lieutenant Charles Clifton, flying as Olds' weapons systems officer, called out additional targets. MiG at 3 o'clock low, MiG climbing through the undercast at 10 o'clock. The battle became a swirling, chaotic furball. Phantoms diving through the clouds chasing MiGs, MiGs trying desperately to disengage, and the deadly white smoke trails of Sidewinders and Sparrows cutting through the gray sky. Forward flight, led by Chappie James, engaged seconds later. James fired a Sparrow at a MiG-21 that was attempting a high-speed slashing attack. The missile missed, but the maneuver forced the MiG pilot into a defensive turn, bleeding energy, setting him up for James's wingman. The wingman fired a Sidewinder. The MiG exploded in a fireball visible from miles away. Rambler Flight joined the fight moments later. Captain Stone in his element found MiGs attempting to escape back toward Chinese airspace. Stone fired a Sparrow at long range. The missile tracked perfectly, its continuous rod warhead detonating in a ring of expanding shrapnel that sliced through the MiG's tail section. The Vietnamese pilot ejected. Stone's wingman claimed 2 more kills in rapid succession, one with a Sparrow and one with a Sidewinder. The engagement lasted exactly 12 minutes. When the last Phantom broke off and headed south toward the refueling tankers, the Americans claimed 7 MiG-21s destroyed. North Vietnamese records, released years later, confirmed 5 MiG-21s lost, with all 5 pilots ejecting safely. Among the pilots who ejected that day was Nguyen Van Coc and another future ace, Vu Ngoc Dinh. Not a single American aircraft was damaged. The devastation was not measured only in lost aircraft. Of the 16 MiG-21s known to be in the Vietnamese People's Air Force inventory at the start of 1967, between 11 and 14 had been committed to the battle. 7 were claimed destroyed by the Americans, with 5 confirmed losses by the Vietnamese. That was nearly half of North Vietnam's most advanced fighter force, obliterated in 12 minutes. The psychological impact was even more profound. The North Vietnamese fighter pilots and their Soviet advisors had believed they understood American tactics. They had believed the F-105s were vulnerable and the F-4s were predictable. They had believed their ground-controlled intercept system gave them an unbeatable advantage. Operation Bolo shattered those beliefs. The Americans had deceived them completely. The intelligence analysis had failed. The radar signatures had lied. The ground controllers had sent their best pilots into a meat grinder. The immediate North Vietnamese response was shock, then anger, then a desperate scramble to understand what had gone wrong. Senior leaders of the Vietnamese People's Air Force convened an emergency after-action review. The findings were damning. The ground-controlled intercept doctrine, which had worked so brilliantly against predictable bombing raids, had failed catastrophically when the Americans decided to deceive rather than conform. The radar operators had been too confident in their ability to distinguish aircraft types by electronic signature. The pilots had been too eager to engage, assuming numerical superiority would compensate for any tactical surprise. The Soviet advisors were summoned. Tactical manuals were rewritten. Training was intensified. Most significantly, the Vietnamese People's Air Force grounded its MiG-21 force for nearly 4 months. The fighters were pulled back to bases in China for retraining and re-equipping. The surviving pilots underwent intensive debriefings. New tactics were developed, tactics that emphasized even greater caution, faster disengagement, and a refusal to commit to sustained dogfights against American fighters. When the MiG-21s returned to combat in the spring of 1967, they were flying a different war. The hit-and-run attacks continued, but the pilots were far more wary. They would zoom in at supersonic speed, fire a single missile, and then zoom, climb away to safety before the Americans could react. They avoided extended turning fights. They never lingered in the combat zone. But the damage to morale and confidence was permanent. 4 days after Operation Bolo, Colonel Olds struck again. On January 6, 1967, he devised another deception. This time, F-4 Phantoms from the 555th Tactical Fighter Squadron flew in tight formation along a flight path regularly used by unarmed RF-4C reconnaissance aircraft photographing targets around Hanoi. North Vietnamese radar operators detected the formation and, assuming it was a vulnerable reconnaissance mission, scrambled MiG-21s. 4 MiG pilots, including Nguyen Van Coc, flying as wingmen, took off from Noi Bai Air Base and climbed through solid cloud to intercept what they believed were easy targets. They broke through the cloud layer and immediately realized they had been deceived again. These were not reconnaissance aircraft. They were F-4 fighters loaded with missiles and waiting for them. The lead Vietnamese pilot, Tran Han, saw the trap immediately and ordered a hard right turn. But his wingmen, Mai Van Coc and Dong Van Die, were still forming up after climbing through the clouds and were slow to react. Nguyen Van Coc, flying in the number 4 position, watched in horror as American missiles with white smoke trails flashed beneath his own aircraft and streaked directly toward Dong Van Die's jet. Coc shouted into his radio, "Eject! Eject! Eject!" Die left his aircraft, but his ejection was not successful. He did not survive. Nguyen Van Coc ejected from his aircraft while still inside the cloud layer and lived. 2 more MiG-21s lost, and the lesson was driven home with brutal finality. The Americans could deceive, adapt, and kill with impunity. The final tally of Operation Bolo and the follow-up mission on January 6th was staggering. 9 MiG-21s destroyed in 2 engagements. No American losses. The Vietnamese People's Air Force had lost more than half of its MiG-21 inventory in less than a week. Years later, Vietnamese government sources admitted that Operation Bolo on January 2nd was one of the worst days for the Vietnamese People's Air Force during the entire war. The strategic implications rippled outward. With the MiG-21 force effectively neutralized, American bombing raids over North Vietnam encountered significantly reduced fighter opposition through the first half of 1967. The loss rate for F-105 Thunderchiefs declined. Strike missions that had previously required massive fighter escorts could now penetrate deeper into North Vietnamese airspace with greater confidence. For the Americans, Operation Bolo became a case study in tactical innovation. The plan demonstrated that even under restrictive rules of engagement, even when denied the ability to attack enemy airfields, a clever and aggressive commander could seize the initiative through deception and superior tactics. The operation validated the F-4 Phantom as an air superiority fighter when properly employed. It proved that American pilots, given the right circumstances, could decisively defeat the vaunted MiG-21. It showed that rigid adherence to doctrine, even successful doctrine, could be exploited by an adaptive enemy. Robin Olds became a legend. He flew 152 combat missions over Southeast Asia, 105 of them over North Vietnam. He scored 4 confirmed MiG kills during his tour, making him a triple ace with a total of 16 aerial victories across World War II and Vietnam. He earned the Air Force Cross for leading a strike against the infamous Paul Doumer Bridge in Hanoi. His decorations included 4 Silver Stars, 6 Distinguished Flying Crosses, and 40 Air Medals. He was promoted to Brigadier General in June of 1968. His leadership style, his tactical brilliance, and his willingness to challenge conventional thinking made him a model for a generation of American fighter pilots. For the North Vietnamese, the lessons of Operation Bolo were absorbed at tremendous cost. Nguyen Van Coc survived his shootdown on January 2nd and returned to active duty with the 921st Fighter Regiment. He would go on to become the highest-scoring ace of the Vietnam War, with 9 credited victories, 7 of them against American aircraft and 2 against unmanned drones. All of his kills were achieved with the K-13 Atoll missile, but he never forgot the day he was lured into an ambush and shot down by the Americans. It shaped his tactics for the rest of his combat career. He became more cautious, more patient, more willing to break off an engagement if the conditions were not perfect. Other Vietnamese pilots learned similar lessons. Nguyen Van Coc, who survived the battles of late 1967, became an ace with 6 kills. Pham Ngoc Lan, when interviewed years later, praised the MiG-21 as much faster than the MiG-17 and noted that its Atoll missiles were very accurate and reliable when fired between 1,000 and 1,200 yards. But he also acknowledged that the MiG-21's high wing loading made it less maneuverable than the older MiG-17 in sustained turning fights. Vietnamese pilots learned to use their advantages, speed and climb rate, while avoiding their disadvantages, endurance and turn performance. The Soviets, watching the debacle from their advisory positions in Hanoi, were forced to confront uncomfortable truths about their equipment and doctrine. The MiG-21 was an excellent interceptor when used correctly, but it was not invincible. Its short range and limited fuel capacity made it dependent on ground-controlled intercept, which made it vulnerable to deception. Its lack of an internal gun in early variants forced pilots to rely entirely on missiles, which in 1967 had low reliability. The radar systems were crude compared to American equipment. The Soviet advisors rewrote their training manuals, emphasizing flexibility over rigid adherence to doctrine. Operation Bolo demonstrated a fundamental truth about military conflict that transcends any single battle or technology. Success in warfare depends not just on having superior equipment or greater numbers, but on the ability to think beyond established patterns and exploit enemy assumptions. The North Vietnamese had built a system that worked brilliantly against predictable opponents. But when the Americans stopped being predictable, when they chose to deceive rather than conform, the entire North Vietnamese air defense framework collapsed in 12 minutes of violent combat over the Red River Delta. The operation forced both sides to evolve. The Americans learned that tactical innovation could overcome numerical disadvantages and restrictive political constraints. They learned that the key to defeating the MiG-21 was not necessarily superior technology, but superior thinking. The North Vietnamese learned that confidence without constant self-examination leads to catastrophic failure. They learned that yesterday's winning tactic becomes tomorrow's fatal vulnerability when the enemy adapts. Both sides emerged from Operation Bolo changed. The Americans emboldened by their success, the North Vietnamese chastened by their losses. The North Vietnamese learned this lesson in blood and fire on January 2, 1967. They scrambled their fighters expecting easy kills. They found an ambush. The MiGs that climbed confidently through the clouds that afternoon flew into a trap set by one of history's great fighter tacticians. The pilots who ejected from burning aircraft, including the man who would become North Vietnam's highest-scoring ace, survived to fight another day. But they never forgot the moment when their confidence turned to shock, when the familiar shapes of American bombers transformed into the deadly silhouettes of phantom fighters, and when the sky filled with the white smoke trails of American missiles hunting them down one by one. That was the moment Operation Bolo rewrote the rules of air combat over Vietnam.